Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am mindful that you are spoiled for choice here this afternoon at GEC. I did all the prep and briefing for my boss, who was supposed to be here today, on all the other things that she was competing against. And so thank you so much for choosing us. We are very grateful for your time and your interest, and I expect and hope your questions and feedback on this. So thank you for coming. My name is Susan Travis. I'm the Head of Research at the Tech Council of Australia. My job, from my perspective, is one of the coolest in the world, at least for me at this point in time. I'm an economist by training. I've worked across the public, private sectors, as well as in places like now in the Tech Council, which is somewhere in between. And it's an absolute delight to be able to be in a place where you have the incentives and the great enthusiasm and trust of the membership behind you to be able to ask all these really important, compelling questions that affect Australians now and well into the future. And the question that motivated this report, or really more of a goal from the Tech Council's point of view, is how we make Australia the best place to start and scale a tech company. For those of you who don't know, the Tech Council is Australia's peak body for the tech sector. We have about 160 members, and they range from 6-people startups through to multinational companies, both founded here in Australia and overseas. They span Australia's traditional strengths in tech in things like SaaS and fintech, through to our Australian Quantum Alliance that has some of the world's leading, and certainly Australia's leading, quantum startups, quantum technology startups and scale-ups. So we are absolutely privileged to be able to have such a broad and diverse group of members who work with us on some of the most pressing policy, research and community matters that are facing the tech sector and indeed Australia now and into the future. As I said, this here is one of our goals. The Tech Council has 3 main policy goals. The first is to have 1.2 million tech workers in Australia by 2030. That's a goal that we're very proud to share with the Australian government and has become the national tech jobs target. The second is, in line with that jobs goal, we are aiming for the tech sector to contribute $250 billion to GDP by 2030. And the third goal is one about opportunity, and it's here what we're talking about today, which is making Australia the best place to start and scale a tech company. So with that, I will get into the presentation. So what Shots on Goal looks at and what it starts by acknowledging is that we're certainly not building from nothing. Australia has had tremendous success in the global tech sector, and that's what we're starting to build on today. What this graph looks at is the really large, successful tech companies and the years in which they were founded. What we can see is that some of these companies were founded many years ago, but a large majority of them are actually pretty young companies. 67 out of the roughly 100 companies that are included in this graph were founded before or after 2010, which is pretty young, particularly in Australian company terms, where in our industrial base we have many older, longer-term companies that have persisted. So that's a really interesting fact for the tech sector. A really excellent fact that we've included here is that there are now at least 20 Australian tech firms valued at over $1 billion, making them unicorns. Despite the success that we can see, and in many tech ecosystems around Australia, particularly here in Melbourne and Victoria, despite the success we've had, we know that Australia can still be a really challenging place to start and scale a tech company. Now, what we did here to put some data behind that was have a look at the survival rates of firms from funding data. Now, it's really hard to compare individual companies on a like-to-like basis, so what we did was we compared a cohort, and we took a cohort of firms founded in 2013 to 2015 in Australia and compared them to the same firms, well, their same counterparts, who were founded in the United States over the same period. And we looked at what the outcomes were from that funding data. And one thing that we found really interesting was at the start, from that left-hand side of the graph, from seed through to Series B, there's not a lot of light between us and the United States. And that's pretty remarkable for a country that has had a successful but is a relatively young tech sector in comparison to that of the United States. What's concerning for us out of this graph is that from Series B onwards, we get a significant divergence from that of the United States. And this clarifies and I think distills with some really interesting data a lot of things that many people in the tech sector, a lot of our members have been telling us for some time, and it's really interesting to see this in stark purple and grey, or black and white as the case may be, on this slide here. This is sort of the main motivating graph, I would say, of this report. And then what we looked at across the course of this report is across the key inputs to scaling, starting and scaling, labour, capital, infrastructure and regulation. Is Australia the best in the world in those, which allows the firms here to be in the best position possible to be competitive on the global stage? So to that end, what I'm going to start talking about is some of the greatest hits of this report. If you'd like to look at all the graphs, they're definitely all in the report on our website, but I'll just be looking at a selection of them today. So the first one here looks at early stage funding. And what we see on the left-hand side is a snapshot of the current state. We see angel and seed funding per capita, us compared to what we call our competitor countries in this report: the United States, Singapore, Israel, the United Kingdom, and Canada. And what we see quite starkly there is we're at the bottom of the leaderboard. On a per capita basis, in terms of working age population, Australia in February 2021 had the lowest amount of angel and seed stage funding per working age person. The good news is on the right-hand side of the graph, and the good news is that it's growing actually incredibly fast. It's not growing as fast as Singapore at an absolute kilter of 400% between 2013 and 2021, but it is growing at about 200%. And for a relatively developed economy like Australia, anything growing at about 200% is growing very, very fast. There is very little in the Australian economy growing that fast. So 200% is pretty good. So what we then did, seeing some of these growth rates, we said, okay, based on what we can see thus far in the recent history, what are these things going to look like by 2030? How much of the problem is essentially solving itself based on the trends we can already see? And how much of there is still going to be a gap that we're going to have to do something about? So for early stage funding, seed to Series B, and then from onwards we looked at later stage funding. What we did was project out with the most conservative growth rate over recent history to look at 2030 and compare us and the United States on a per capita basis for working age population. And what we found on the left-hand side is that for early stage funding on a per capita basis, we will look pretty similar by the United States by 2030 if recent trends continue. Later stage, however, is a very different story. By 2030, if we don't do anything else, we expect there'll be a roughly $53 billion funding gap between us and the United States. And again, that's on a per capita basis. It's not absolute terms. The United States is a much bigger country than us. But on a reasonable comparison, there will be a manifestly stark difference between the capital available to companies here looking to scale and those that are otherwise similar in the United States. And that's something we think we should do something about. Now, looking a bit more into this is a slide from a separate report, but I thought worth bringing out here, because even if, say, and we can see on the left-hand side on that previous graph, there is no gap, there's no purple there, that's good. Within that number, there can still be variation, and that variation could be across states. So for instance, in New South Wales, you may have no problem, but in Victoria, you may well. We can also perhaps see that variation across some of the subsectors. So if you're in fintech, for instance, it may be the fact that there are lots of people with experience and capital available to invest in those sorts of startups. If you're in AI, perhaps, maybe there's less opportunity available there in Australia. To that end, what I did in this presentation was included a couple of slides from a previous report we did called Making Australia into a Regional Tech Hub. And what we did there was we had a look at where Australian VC funding has historically been focused relative to their global counterparts. And this first slide looks here at basically Australian VC funding and the number of Australian startups, so sort of like a per capita type look at this sort of thing. And we see lots and lots of funding relative to the number of startups going into things like diversified fintech, pay tech, business software, things that we're all very familiar with in the Australian tech ecosystem and that many people have been very, very successful in. What we see here is then on the vertical axis, we look at the Australian VC funding, so the percentage of the total funding they allocate to different subsegments like pay tech, environment tech, the same ones as on the previous slide. But on the x-axis here, the horizontal axis, we have global VC funding and the percentage they allocate to particular subsectors. And we can see that those above that 45-degree line, that grey line running through the middle, those that sit above that line in Australia get relatively more funding, a bigger chunk of the given portfolio than their global peers on average, and vice versa for those underneath the line. And what we can see from this, it's a little hard in this presentation because we've got so many dots there I'm mindful of, is that what we found is that Australian VCs seem to invest less in some of the sensitive segments, things like AI and cybersecurity. So when we're thinking about that funding gap, the slide that I had before which showed that we don't expect a big gap at startup, but we do expect a big gap at scale up, one of the things we also need to keep in mind when we go forth with solutions is there may be some variation underneath that, and that may be on a segment level like we're seeing here. The good news is that Australia is actually pretty good at attracting global funding, and Australia is a net capital importer, and certainly our tech sector as a net capital importer, that's going to remain a really important fact of our tech sector for some time. And there's some sectors that in particular are particularly good at attracting global funding, things like quantum, things like energy tech, media and design, that attract a greater share of total VC funding than we have of global GDP, which is a sort of a benchmark for where is Australia punching our weight on average in terms of economic terms. So that's the good news. The other pieces of good news that we think are really important is that there's new initiatives like the National Reconstruction Fund and Breakthrough Victoria here that are bringing in new funding into the system, and they're bringing it in two ways. One is they themselves have capital to spend, and that's very promising and that's very helpful. The second part of it is they have the ability to bring in co-investment, and they have the ability, when appropriate, to provide capital to things that otherwise perhaps wouldn't be funded because they don't have the check size of other people, but allows other forms of funders to come in alongside them. So that's very promising. And we said that on the left-hand side. For this Shots on Goal report, we use the NRF as a thought exercise in some sense to work through the motions of how much funding could possibly be available from these sorts of vehicles. And with the potential crowd in addition to what the NRF is expected to spend for critical technologies, we see there's the possibility of there being about $7 billion in funding available between now and 2030 because of the NRF. There's also lots of other initiatives alongside that, but that is a thought exercise of what the potential crowd in could be. The slight complication to this story is on the right-hand side. So we said, okay, $7 billion, that's great. $5.1 billion is not coming from the NRF, it's coming from other places. Where could it possibly come from? Is there even enough money in the Australian system to support that kind of investment? And based on historical trends, we looked at the people who contribute to tech funding in Australia, and we can see obviously that super is going to have a role, other private investors are going to have a role, and FDI, based on historical trends, will probably continue to have a fairly important role in funding new ventures in tech, and scale-ups in particular. Now that will require, in order to match to co-investments of just the NRF alone, we will need to see about a 20% uplift in FDI going into startups and scale-ups. And that's annual based on the previous rate. So if they do a big 20% jump and keep that up, they will match what we think is sort of an average, reasonable, middle of the course path for the NRF. That means we're going to have those complementary policy vehicles like the Foreign Investment Review Board in a position to be able to hand a 20% uplift. That's a pretty big jump in demand. Now, why we care about this so much is for a number of reasons. One of the core ones for us, and I mentioned this at the start, is that we have a national tech jobs target of 1.2 million tech workers by 2030. Now, there's that discrete goal and the policy ambition, all the things that happen beside it and around it. But in spirit, what it's about is ensuring that Australians have great economic opportunities, that Australians now into the future have great jobs where they're building important things and making the world a better place. Now, becoming the best place in the world to start and scale a tech company will help to fuel future tech jobs growth. We've seen tremendous growth from the mid-1980s until now, which we see here on this slide, where tech occupations have grown at 4 times the pace of all other occupations. If we want this to continue, we know that we need to be globally competitive, and we know that we need the things that we've talked about thus far in the slides previous to this. We need enough capital, we need the right complementary policy mechanisms in place in order for the companies that are starting to get the funding that they need. We also know that tech jobs are really great jobs. They're some of the highest paid in the economy. And we're showing with SEEK data here that high salaries in the direct tech sector are persisting despite the turbulence that we're seeing in some of the tech companies over recent history. One of the really great facts that we saw in the tech jobs update we recently did with the government that isn't here is that tech jobs on average now have the second highest average advertised salary in the economy, only second to CEOs. That is a phenomenal fact that we need to persist, and one that is above and beyond, I think, most people's expectations. One of the complications to this, and this comes to the labour or talent part of the story that we looked at in this report, is that historically we've had a problem with domestic training pipelines to get people into tech. And what that means now is that we essentially have a generation of missing tech workers. What we've got here is data on the number of students, domestic students, I believe, completing ICT courses. Now, there's 2 sorts of courses, obviously, at universities you can complete, undergraduate and postgraduate. The trend is pretty similar here. Postgraduate for reasonable justifications is slightly smaller, but the trend is fairly similar. In 2021 and 2022, now that we've got the new data, we have literally nominally the same number of Australian students graduating from ICT degrees as we did in 2002. Now, Australia's population, Australia's economy has grown considerably over this time. There's not many things that stay the same in terms of particularly training pipelines across about 20 years for a country that's grown as much as ours has, particularly in population. There's not a lot that you would look at in labour economics that is exactly the same from 2002. This is a pretty stark fact, and this is one thing that we're committed to figuring out how to better address. One of the things, the downstream impacts of having that generation of missing tech workers coming through the university system, I mean, there are many other pipelines to getting into tech, of course. One of the downstream impacts of that is that we don't have as many people with scale-up experience. So what we've done here is estimated the share of tech workforces, or the tech workforce in different countries with scale-up experience. And we've compared ourselves here to the other competitor countries that I noted before. They're the same as on the funding slides. What we see here in Singapore is that they probably have about 17% of their tech workforce that have scale-up experience. And that's a factor of 2 things. It's driven by, first, the number of scale-ups they have, and Singapore has a disproportionately high number of very large unicorn tech companies. They also have a relatively small tech workforce. The combination of these 2 facts means they have a relatively large estimated bit of their tech workforce who has experience in scaling up. By comparison, while we've been quite successful, we don't have as many scale-ups here in Australia, and we actually have a very, very large tech workforce, particularly that which works across the economy. Now, that's great because they're really important in the work that they do, making sure that we have great tech adoption across all sorts of sectors. But for this graph and for people hiring in scale-ups across Australia, it's a really challenging fact. And this fact in particular has really resonated with a lot of the people who work in talent in our companies and our membership, because the thing that many of those people who work in scale-up struggle with every day is the number of people putting in job applications wanting to come work for them who do, or in fact often do not have scale-up experience, which is not necessarily their fault. It's a function of the history of our ecosystem, and it's a big gap that we need to think about. This means that, looking out to 2030, what we know is that our tech sector faces this looming gap of experienced people, particularly those in scale, but also technical people. And this speaks to an extent to the graph that I showed you before about the generation of missing tech workers, that big U-shape of people who weren't there, who then didn't graduate between 2002 and 2022, didn't go get work experience, aren't now experienced, and aren't in some of those dark purple bits of this graph. This graph breaks up the tech workforce as a whole into a fairly stylised form. We've got along the horizontal axis 4 groups of tech workers. So from the left-hand side going to the right, we have operational and support, the business type roles, think legal and HR, sort of the backbone of keeping the company running as it is a company. The second bit is thinking about creative and commercial, so jobs like UX designers and product managers. The third is digital technicians and trades, things like ICT support technicians that answer all your questions when I can't get into my email because it's logged me out again. And the fourth is technical professionals, things like software engineers, cybersecurity professionals, data scientists. As you'll see, the forecast degree of shortage gets worse as it gets darker, and the darker bits are on this right-hand side of that graph. We also have this massive bit of about 345,000 people that we need in some of those technical roles. Now, to be clear, not all of them will be missing. This is the projected potential size of the workforce by 2030, but we know that's the bit that will be really big and really struggle from very sticky shortages, and that's a challenge that we need to address. Now, I've spoken a lot about lots of problems that we need to address, and here is started the pathway to what the solutions that we're thinking about. So what we did in thinking about getting to 1.2 million tech workers, with many of the challenges that I've spoken about here, and also others including that of improving diversity in our tech workforce, we've been thinking about the buckets and the pathways to getting to 1.2 million and doing so in a way that addresses a lot of those challenges. Now, starting in 2023, we know there's about 935,000 people currently working in tech, and that is terrific. Thank you to everyone here who is a tech worker and who is one of those 935,000 people. Now, we know that people will retire, move on, do other stuff across the economy and their lives, and we think there's going to be about 300,000 of them between now and 2030. We then have 3 possible pathways, very broadly speaking, for people to get into tech. We know that entry-level training from university and the vet system is really important, and we know that's going to contribute a certain number. We forecast that at about 122,000. But in order to get to that 1.2 million, we think there's going to need to be a bit of an uplift. That is also true across reskilling pathways, which is that second bucket, and the last one, which is migrants coming in from the skilled migration system. Now, importantly, all of these buckets are complementary and they generally can't replace each other. Junior workers coming straight and being retrained, or being initially trained rather, from the university and vet system can't go be a chief technology officer in a massive company on day 2 of their career. Vice versa, we're not going to bring in really, really experienced software engineers from overseas and other companies and put them in entry-level roles. We also know that reskilling people is a really, really powerful way to bring in other complementary skills across the workforce. And we know that Australia has done this quite well, albeit not always intentionally, although we're increasingly doing so now. We look at a lot of the areas in which Australia has been really successful in tech. FinTech is a great example. Mining tech is a great example. There are lots of people with domain expertise, with a contextual understanding, who themselves may also have technical skills or work with other people who do, to build fantastic companies and products that take off and scale globally. So continuing to bring in those people and making sure the pathways are as wide and as numerous within these big buckets into the tech sector is really important, and a lot of that falls in that middle bucket of retraining and upskilling. Now, importantly, the migration system is also a really important pathway, particularly for people with scale-up experience, particularly for addressing that missing generation of tech workers that we can't rewind the clock on. Bringing people in who have the skills and experience to take on the roles that we have massive gaps in is crucial to growing the tech sector and crucial to making sure that the new people coming through have the mentoring and training and high-quality mentoring and training, and enough of them, in order to grow our tech workforce. One of the key constraints, which we're very glad to see the government addressing, is visa processing times. Now, this in policy we call a little pig policy question. For many people outside of policy and who don't think about these things every day, this may seem like an overly technical, minor technical detail. But for those of you in tech, and particularly for those of you who work in talent or in management of these things, you'll know that visa processing times is actually really, really important. It's basically the talent version of the getting to market time. If you have really experienced, really excellent people who have 2 job offers, one is to Australia and one is to Canada, and Canada, like Israel, can get your visa processed in 10 days, and Australia, as you can see in this graph, could take up to 1,000, which are you going to go to? Now, it's a very minor technical detail, but it's a really powerful one and it's really important, and we're very glad to see the government is intent and committed to addressing these problems and ensuring that Australian tech companies and tech companies based in Australia can effectively compete in global talent markets alongside their competitors. Finally, I spoke a bit about this before, but I think it's worth re-emphasising. There's lots of pathways that are going to take us to 1.2 million tech workers and well beyond, hopefully into the future. A really important one that we're doing a lot of work on with both the Commonwealth Government and the New South Wales Government is creating new pathways to enter the tech industry through retraining and upskilling programs. One of the things we're working on now, this is very, I think, similar in spirit across the New South Wales Government and the Commonwealth Government initiatives, is having earn while you learn programs. Programs that people who are in other jobs can move into without sacrificing, ongoing life obligations and the broader context that their lives exist in, that can offer rapid reskilling options that take 12 months, not many years, that can give them an opportunity to work in many of the priority and growing areas of the tech sector, like cyber roles, data analyst roles, for which often a lot of domain expertise can be really, really useful, and getting on-the-job experience with companies. This is going to be essential to getting to that 1.2 million tech worker target. It's going to be essential to making sure that we can improve the diversity of the tech sector. It's going to be essential to making sure that the tech sector can continue to grow. Now, with this all together, as I said before, I've talked a lot about problems, I've talked a little bit about solutions, summing it all up into where we're going forward from this. This is a very high-level stylised version of our plan for more shots on goal, and there's 4 important components to this plan. The first is having a really clear strategic direction. This will typically be led by governments, and we see this in particularly some states. Queensland have a great digital economy strategy. Many other states have similar initiatives, and we're excited to see the Commonwealth Government hopefully do this more in the future. They have excellent strategies, for instance, right now about the direction of quantum technology in Australia that we were very glad to contribute to. And the reason why we want the strategic direction, which I think will probably be manifestly obvious to most people, is so you can put your effort in that direction. It's really important also in big complex systems with lots of players and lots of people doing lots of stuff to have strategic direction, not just for effort to go in the right direction, but for the cooperation that goes across that effort to be working well together. The second really important pillar of this plan is local foundations, and this speaks to the policies that governments can put in place across capital, talent, infrastructure and regulation that exclusively are within their jurisdiction. So things like what can they do to directly invest in their tech sector, be it grants programs, things like equity funds, so on and so forth. There's things like local foundations we think of as universities, the vet system, other training opportunities that exist within there. That's a bit distinct from global integration. And the reason that we break these out is that the tech sector broadly, which is similar to some parts of the Australian economy, but certainly not all, is a globally facing sector. Being globally competitive is an absolute necessity to surviving and for companies to be able to survive. So it's really important that we have those global integration policies in that third column really clearly called out because they're incredibly important for the tech sector. We need both local foundations and global integration mechanisms working well. They're complementary, and just because you have one doesn't mean you have the other. Now, in global integration, it's both about effectively facilitating and at times regulating the global flows of capital and labour in particular. The fourth column we have here, the fourth pillar of this plan for more shots on goal, is measurement. And this is something that we think a lot of governments around Australia at the state level and also the Commonwealth Government could do a lot better. What we'd like to see is a scorecard of sorts for Australia as a place to start and scale a tech company. And the breadth of the KPIs or the measures or the metrics that you would have on this, we think should speak to particularly both of the pillars in the middle of this, both 2 and 3. Traditionally in Australia, when we think about do we have the right settings for a tech sector, we think about the things often with tech in front of it or that are very directly relevant. Things like AI regulation, things like, to an extent, copyright, things like funding that's directed at the tech sector, things like RDTI, grants programs. But across the course of this presentation, and you'll know every day in the work that you do, there's lots of other things that are not called tech that are incredibly integral to the success of a tech sector. Things like visa processing times, things like whether or not you have foreign investment reviews that can be done with a reasonable level of certainty and transparency as is appropriate. There's lots of other measures that are not typically tech policy or industry policy that are absolutely essential to the success of a tech sector. And we'd like to see them on a scorecard. We'd like to track them so that we can work together to make sure we're on track. Now that's the end of the slides that I have here today. I'm mindful I've given you a very, very broad look at all the things we're thinking about, but I promise you there is even more up on our website in this report, Shots on Goal. So with that, thank you. Thank you for coming and being here today, and I'm very happy to take questions if you have any. Okay, I will start with the gentleman in the middle.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions. In one of the early slides where you showed the decline in moving from Series B to Series C for Australia compared to the US, one of the possible explanations for that is that in Australia you might, at the end of Series B, you might go to an IPO or a trade sale, whereas in the US you might go to a Series C. So have you got any information on the relative percentage of IPOs and trade sales at the end of Series B?
We don't have that, but we had, in the lead up to this report, we had 2 big streams of work going. One is the quantitative stuff and ends up in the graphs you see on the screen, and the other is a qualitative set of workshops and meetings and interviews that we have with lots of experts and members across the tech sector. And this came up quite a bit with lots of members across workshops in terms of what is the exit, what are the possible paths, what does success look like? And fundamentally, is that different for an Australian founded and based company than it is otherwise for a company that's exactly the same but happened to be born somewhere else effectively? And they spoke a bit about what you've mentioned there in terms of there's sometimes a shorter path between starting an IPO. Now, for some people, that may be the path they want to take. That may be what success is for their company and that team. That's great. But one of the things that we're mindful of is we don't want the pathway to whatever the outcome is to be unnecessarily shortened just because there is a lesser amount of capital in the local ecosystem. So I do think that is definitely an outcome. I don't have data on it, but anecdotally we're told that's the case. I would question, though, whether or not that is a good outcome for everyone. And if we fix some of that gap in funding that we see, perhaps that will necessarily start to push out a bit.
Thank you. And my second question was, you focused on domestic students at the undergraduate level, but probably about, for many Australian universities, about half the students in the tech space are international onshore, who then go on to post-study work rights, and many of them subsequently become permanent residents. And you didn't talk about that element of the talent pipeline, or is that caught up in one of your other graphs with visas? Because I would have thought that was a huge part of the talent pipeline.
It's a huge part, and it's a really important part, and they're not excluded by any means for that graph because they're any less important. I think that's worthwhile stating. There's been a challenge for some time in Australia when we look at the macro environment of the labour market and the pipelines into the tech sector in terms of retention of international students. Lots of people come here to go to the universities and through the vet system sometimes to study tech and then leave. Now, that may be well what they want to do with their lives, and that's absolutely fine if that's the case. We do know there have been some complications in terms of the ability to have long enough on post-study work rights in order to be competitive in the labour market. Lots of employers have told us that there are situations where they look at people who would be great, but they don't know if they'll get this, they don't know what the visa is, it's just too hard, particularly when the companies are smaller. to hire those people, and that's something that we've been very pleased to see that this government has changed. They've extended some of the post-study work rights, particularly for people who are studying in this area and other priority areas. I'm not sure if that's the right terminology, but that's essentially what they've focused on. So that's good. The reason that we focused on domestic students here is that it speaks to sort of the long-term cultural norms and the difficulties that we have had with getting enough people into tech. Necessarily, and I think in many great ways, a lot of those people will be more recent migrants in one way or another. They may come as international students, they may come as people with experience. But we do think it is important for people who are born here to be able to have great economic opportunities, to be able to have really bright futures in sectors like tech. And what we can see is that there has been something very strange going on in tech. Many people talk about the dot-com boom and the pessimism that came around that, and the risk aversion perhaps in many Australian households around whether or not they wanted their kids to go in something that had just imploded, which is understandable. But nonetheless, we do think from an opportunity perspective, it's worthwhile sometimes separating the domestic pipelines to make sure that we do have the right pathways, equitable and open pathways for Australians as well into those jobs. Yes.
Like what we've seen with, startup incentives a few years ago with Startup Chile and all things where suddenly geographies were, outdoing each other about, we'll give you more money if you come to us and whatnot. So have you looked into what is the stuff that we can sensibly do in countries like the visa processing times versus things that are likely just going to be kind of ratcheting up the race for tech talent?
Really interesting question. On many of these questions, and this is probably clearer in writing the report, what we've sought to do here is step back and take like a very 50,000 foot view and think about it from a systems perspective of, do we have the right inputs to the ecosystem? The next logical step there is then thinking about interventions, as you've rightly pointed out, as to what will be helpful and have the desired outcomes that you may wish for, or perhaps have very odd second or sometimes indeed third order effects. We haven't quite gotten to that stage yet, and partly I think that's because of the nature of the organisation that we are. We think a lot about the policy solutions, but I think that's going to be a really interesting one going forward when we further this sort of work, and a lot of work that we've done through our digital employment forum that brings together big employers like the Commonwealth Bank and BHP and people like that who are not necessarily tech firms but are big employers of tech workers, and thinking about the specific interventions we have there. Most of the ones that we are thinking about in workforce are on the supply side, because quite consistently when we've done quite a few workforce reports, that's been our major priority over the last 2 years since we were founded, addressing the endemic shortages. We can see a lot of them are supply driven. We can see that wages are really high. We can see that conditions are really good. It's not to say that there's not necessarily any room for things in the tech sector to be better and to grow and evolve. That will certainly be the case, as it's part of a country that will continue to grow and evolve as well. But we think rather than on the demand side, it's mostly on the supply side. So I think in spirit, in answering your question, we haven't really looked at them because we know the problem is on the supply side, so we're focusing on that for the time being. Yes.
The 1.2 million jobs have been around for quite some time. Has any of the data or the actual technology skill sets been reconsidered now that generative AI has been more popular?
Great question. The 1.2 million tech jobs target has been around since early 2022, I think is when the government signed on to it shortly before they were elected. We did an update in 2023, so we've updated the data as to how many tech workers there are. That's where the 935,000 figure came from. That's really good because we're getting towards 1 million, and I am angling and advocating for a cake at 1 million. There can be balloons, there can be streamers and whatnot. Now, in terms of the methodology underneath that number, that hasn't changed. That's stayed consistent over time, and that's mainly so we can have a sort of fair and reasonable comparison over time of, do we have the right people in the count? Now, it's an excellent question in terms of generative AI because we've had this important punctuated equilibrium moment, and that sometimes is really challenging for what otherwise is ostensibly sensible methodological decisions that are consistent over time. So you have fair and reasonable comparisons, and you compare apples with apples. But there are times in which context demands that you sometimes change those things. In this case, I don't think it is significantly challenging to our methodology because within that, and the list of occupations that we have within that are online. It should be in the recent Tech Jobs Update report. If it's not, please let me know. And we have a really wide group of both technical and non-technical occupations within tech. So things like ICT managers are in there, which is an ANSCO occupation, which will broadly cover lots of different things we call managers. And there are also things like software applications, programmers, which is a very big category, which has software engineers and whatnot in there. While to some extent some of the application has changed and people will build a lot of things and are already building heaps of really great things on this new technology that has really taken off now, I don't think, and to what I'm seeing thus far in the tech jobs numbers, that hasn't radically shifted anything in terms of the demand for types of skills. Part of that is a function, I think, of the statistical stuff that the government run, which sits underneath this. So they define what the categories are in ANSCO, for those of you who aren't well across those particular methodologies. And they're actually quite broad. So within that, we may see job ads changing, for instance. So you may not have as much demand for people who are coding in R, for instance. And you may need more people who have other sorts of skills, experience and applications, as well as like literal skills that you put in a job ad. So some of that may change, but I think that will, and to my knowledge at this point, that's all still happening within the fairly broad occupational categories that we then stack up and get to our tech jobs number from. Does that effectively answer your question?
Yeah, it does, and I think maybe it's a bit too premature to actually change anything, but there's obviously some of the strategies may change because the industry demand will change.
Definitely. And we're keen to keep monitoring that and see how that plays out in terms of, as you quite rightly, I think, at least I think you've implied, counting tech jobs may necessarily need to evolve as the industry does as well. Thank you. Yes.
I'm curious about the retraining and reskilling issues. Have you got any examples of what that looks like for the global nation and they're doing better than we are? Are we doing at all?
It's a great question. I think one of the really great things about the Australian tech sector is there is no shortage of enthusiasm and there is no shortage of willingness to try new things. And what we are seeing, particularly in the retraining space, is that lots of people are doing lots of different sorts of things. We're seeing a lot of work, particularly with VET providers, in order to change how some of those qualifications work. So there is both the right sort of stuff that employees want in those qualifications and there's better connections with industry, and there's lots of different bits to that problem, which is really challenging and has been for some time. There's lots of people who are running their own programs within house to train people up. There's lots of, and particularly on the bigger end of things, companies like Microsoft and Google that not just has vendor certifications, but Google, for instance, have lots of their learning certificates now online. So there's lots of different forms and types of retraining. There's lots and lots of stuff going on. What I think can potentially be really powerful about having some sort of central agreed consensus on what an official training, in some sense, program will look like will not just be about the program itself or how you may line up with other things that exist, but for the ability to have clearer signalling in the labour market on what the pathways into things look like and how that compares to other offerings. There's not much more detail that I can share right now except what was on that slide before in terms of the sorts of things we're looking at and the type of program. We know for many tech employers, some of those are really, really crucial details. Having something that is 12 months long, having something that is earn while you learn is really important to lots of people. But beyond that, I can't share that much more except to say I think it's going to be really powerful in what it is, but also how it lines up to everything else and perhaps connects a lot of the activity that's already underway in the tech sector. Hopefully that helps. Brilliant. Any other questions? No. On that, then, I may close the session unless anyone from GEC wishes to speak or, once again, forever hold their peace. No. Okay. With that, a very final thank you to all of you for your time and your questions and your interest. If you have any other questions that you'd like to ask, but perhaps don't want to ask right now, you're very welcome to come up to me afterwards. I'll hang around and have a chat to anyone who is interested and willing. Have a great rest of your day.